planning is an easily learned and highly adaptable process to prepare for and manage through changes in your operating context. In this video, we will share a simple approach you can use with your team, adapting it to fit your needs and circumstances. Let's begin by looking at the role of scenario planning within the larger discipline of adaptive management. In the international development sector, the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, has been a thought leader in using adaptive management and helping others apply its approaches in their work. This graphic depicts USAID's Collaborating, Learning, and Adapting, or CLA, framework. CLA is how USAID implements adaptive management. Scenario planning, circled on the left, is a key component of the learning portion of the CLA framework. For each component listed in the inner portion of the wheel, USAID has developed illustrative maturity stages. Let's take a look at the stages for scenario planning. This slide shows the 5 stages of maturity for scenario planning, from not yet present on the left to institutionalized on the right. The methodology we will present in this video can help your team achieve a maturity level of advanced or even institutionalized. The characteristics of effective scenario planning, which apply across all maturity stages, include identifying and anticipating factors outside of your control that may impact your work. These factors could be political, social stability, public health, economic conditions, or others. Developing alternate scenarios and monitoring trends related to these scenarios, and using early warning signals to respond to context changes in real time based on prior planning. As with any systematic, intentional, and resourced adaptive management approach, the important thing is to be thoughtful about how you are working as a team for better results. Here are some of the core principles that underpin scenario planning as an effective adaptive management approach. Acceptance that our success or failure may be linked to factors beyond our control. Foresight to be deliberate to understand contextual factors that could impact our plans and intended results. Intentionality about planning for multiple scenarios. Preparation to adapt is better than flexibility to react. Collaboration among team members, stakeholders, and funders to ensure that everyone is a part of this collective learning and planning methodology. And learning from our experience while including others' perspectives. So with that, let's look at the scenario planning process we've developed. Keep in mind that scenario planning is a process that can be adapted to many different situations, and this is just one example. You are welcome to adapt this approach and tool to fit your needs. Scenario planning follows a 3-step process. The first step is framing. In this step, you've already decided you'd like to launch a scenario planning approach due to the impact of a change in your operating environment that is outside of your control. Start by identifying and defining this change. It may be positive or negative. Either way, it impacts your team's ability to continue working as planned. This change is called your prompting event. In the framing step, you will identify your prompting event, then assess how it may impact or has already begun to impact your activities interventions. The second step is planning. In this step, you will develop a few possible scenarios that describe ways to adapt your activities interventions in light of the prompting event. This step is what most people think of when considering scenario planning, but notice it is one of 3 steps in the process. To respond effectively to the risks and opportunities in your environment, the planning step needs to be done together with the other 2 steps. The third step is monitoring and adapting. In this step, you will document changes in your operating environment as they unfold and the adaptations you make in response to those changes. In other words, what has happened and what are you doing as a result? This step lasts as long as the impact of your prompting event. Let's take a look at a tool designed to help you apply these steps in a planned and productive way. Here's what the 3 steps look like in the scenario planning tool. Notice that the tool has a section for each of the 3 steps and guidance on how to fill it out. The tool is meant to aid you and your team in the scenario planning process by providing relevant questions and space to document important changes. It is also meant to be adaptable to your needs. Now we will walk through the scenario planning process, describing how the tool supports each of the 3 steps. In step 1, framing, you will populate the template with information that keeps you and your team grounded in your core purpose, the interventions to achieve that purpose, and the event that is prompting you to consider how your work needs to adjust. This step documents your frame of reference. Begin by filling out the first column on the left, your activity's name and location, and overarching goal. Below that, in the same column, list the primary interventions for your activity as they have been originally designed or planned, one in each row. For example, these could be data collection, trainings, community meetings, and more. Remember, this is the framing step. You are not describing or documenting changes yet. Use this space to document your work as planned. In the second column, add information related to the prompting event that is leading you to adapt your work. First, add the time frame of the scenario planning activity, which is the length of time you anticipate observing changes in your operating environment. For instance, do you expect the prompting event to lead you to deviate from your planned interventions for a month, 90 days, or something else? Estimate the duration of the impact on your activity and revise it later if necessary. Below the time frame, describe the prompting event and how you expect it to change your operating environment. The prompting event may be positive, like a reduction in conflict, or negative, such as a natural disaster or a supply chain interruption. Try to narrow down the scope of your prompting event to the way that it impacts your work. For example, COVID-19 is too broad because it can have a wide range of impacts. An easier prompting event to work with is new government restrictions in the number of people who can gather in person. You'll see another example in a moment. Finally, in this column, document how each of your primary interventions, those listed in the first column, may be impacted by your prompting event. In the third column, describe your current situation. At the top, enter the date when you are beginning this documentation. Below the date, name or describe your current state. For instance, your team may be experiencing major disruption from a significant and unexpected prompting event, or perhaps your context and work are changing much more gradually. Finally, describe how each of your planned interventions listed in the first column are being adapted for your current conditions. Here's a completed example of documentation for the framing step. As a reminder, the first column on the left describes the activity as planned, including its goal and primary interventions. The second column describes the prompting event, in this case, a teacher strike, and how the team anticipates it may impact those primary interventions. The third column describes the activity at the point in time when the team begins their scenario planning process, including the current state for each of their primary interventions. You're welcome to pause the video if you'd like more time to read this example. When you are ready, continue on to step 2. In step 2, you begin documenting scenarios. A good place is to start to identify 3 possible scenarios based on your prompting event. If it helps, you can think of these 3 as most likely, best case, and worst case, but those descriptors will not always be fitting. Be as specific as possible in naming and describing each scenario so that this documentation can be understood and used effectively by all impacted team members. The team may decide that it's relevant to consider and plan for more than 3 scenarios, and in that case, simply add more columns in the tool for that documentation. You don't need to identify and document every possible scenario. Focus on those that will best support your team in meeting your primary activity goal despite your changing conditions. Then, for each of the interventions you listed in the framing step, describe how it may be adapted if or when this scenario becomes reality. In the actual tool, you will be able to see that documentation to the left of your scenarios, as you will see later in this video. Your goal in filling out these rows is to determine how you can best adapt your primary interventions so that the team is better prepared to adapt and continue. Here is a completed example of documentation for the planning step. The 3 scenarios this team has chosen are teacher strike ends, teacher strike lasts 2 weeks, and teacher strike persists beyond 2 months. In the bottom half of the spreadsheet are the alternate plans the team has created for each intervention in the event that these scenarios unfold. Again, you're welcome to pause the video if you'd like more time to read the example. In step 3, you conduct ongoing monitoring of your scenarios and adaptations to your interventions. Each time you do this monitoring step, record the date and add a name and description for the situation at that point in time. Add additional columns as you continue to monitor your operating environment and possible scenarios. This documentation helps to record changes in your operating context over time, and in the rows below it, how you adapted each intervention to these conditions. Your notes here can help the team consider appropriate adaptations as your operating context continues to change. It can also be useful in future scenario planning for different prompting events and for your ongoing reporting needs. This step will look different depending on your situation. If your prompting event is changing rapidly, you may need to monitor and adapt weekly or even daily. For less dynamic situations, you may revisit this tool as part of regular monitoring on a monthly basis. Whatever your situation, use this portion of the tool to check in regularly on your scenarios and adaptations. Here's a completed example of documentation for the monitoring and adapting step. In the first column, the team recorded when the strike expanded to another district and how their interventions were adapted for this scenario. In this example, the strike ended just 3 days later, which the team documented in the next column, and they were able to resume their interventions as originally planned. Here are all 3 steps on our example, documented in the scenario planning tool. If the strike had not ended on April 9th, the team would have continued adding columns to step 3 as they continued to monitor the situation and how they adapted their interventions. Again, feel free to pause the video if you would like to review their use of the tool. There are 3 key ingredients to keep in mind when planning to facilitate your scenario planning process. The first is people. Which team members will you involve? How will they be involved? Which external stakeholders, such as community members, local government representatives, and funders may be involved, and how? The second is time. How much time can you allocate to your scenario planning process? When will you conduct ongoing monitoring once your scenarios are developed? Knowing this may influence your decisions about who to involve and how. Lastly, which data points will you consult as you develop possible scenarios and intervention adaptations? You may consult context monitoring indicators, your adaptive management plan or CLA plan, your monitoring and evaluation plan, your work plan, your theory of change, or your activity budget. Remember that your primary goal is to guide your team in preparing for and responding to changes in your operating environment that could affect your ability to implement your interventions as planned. As you prepare to facilitate this process, know that scenario planning can also help teams to become more aligned on activity priorities, develop a shared vision, embody a learning culture founded on openness, continuous learning, and improvement, discover other opportunities for evidence-based decision-making and adaptation, and to align with your funder and other key stakeholders. Keep these ancillary outcomes front of mind as you plan, letting them inform each aspect of your facilitation approach. You can find more tips for facilitating a scenario planning process in the resources section of this course.